Okay, I'd like to take a quick look at trigger locks here and explain their deficiencies. I have a bit of a irrational dislike of them, but I do have my reasons. There are two here. Now I've got this little red one, which is mostly plastic and a small bolt, probably made out of zinc. It's made in China. I've gotten a lot of these with various firearms that I've purchased here in Michigan that require a trigger lock to be sold with them. A better one would be something like this. It's much better built. It's heavy. It won't fall apart. You can't just chip away with a screwdriver and get it off. But they both suffer from the same problem, and that is they require you to feed a bolt through the trigger guard in order to secure them to the gun. Now, basic gun handling safety rules. Rule number 2 is that you never touch the trigger until you're ready to fire. What's kind of unstated there is that you never put anything in the trigger guard unless you're ready to fire. Now, I verified that the weapon's unloaded, so I feel safe doing this. I've got a safe backstop if it were to be loaded. But if I were to stick a foreign object through this trigger guard and play around with it, that's still a violation of rule number 2. And I don't see why trigger locks are accepted from that. What you basically are doing here is affixing something that's a safety violation to your gun. Now, I'm going to actually try and apply this trigger lock. It may take a bit, so if you see a bit of video editing later on, then that will explain that. I'm not pulling any shenanigans here. But, here we go. Now that I've got this on, I'm still perfectly able to load the weapon. Now I'm using a snap cap here. It's a little red plastic round. It cannot fire, but it will function just like a regular cartridge would, at least as far as speeding goes. Now magazine's inserted. There we go. Now I've got a live round in the chamber, or I would have a live round in the chamber if I was using a real ammunition. Now, because I've actually put the lock on there correctly, it will not fire. I can't just jiggle this around and pull the trigger. But if it was installed incorrectly, well, now I've got this bolt sitting right there. I don't really care for these. We're talking about, securing a weapon as cheap as possible here to keep kids away from it. And they're ingenious little buggers. If there's a way to fire that weapon, they will eventually find it. What's a lot better to do, in my opinion, is to use something like a cable lock. And a cable lock will render the weapon completely inoperable. So what I've got here is just a simple leather strap. Now you'd actually want to use a cable, but I don't have one handy here, but this will work for demo purposes. Even this would still require at least a knife to get off. Whereas a cable would require bolt cutters or a hacksaw or something like that. And if your children are going to do something like that to your weapons, well, there's really not a whole lot you can do to keep them up. So with this simple cable run through the action, now you of course want to secure it with a padlock of some kind. That'll at least keep everything together. With that cable lock installed, or with a cable through the action, I can't load this weapon. I mean, there's no way to fit that through there. If I were to try and take a single round of ammunition and then drop it into the chamber, I still can't get this thing to fire because that lock this cable is going to keep everything out of battery. Unless I find a way to actually remove this from the gun, I can't load it, I can't pull the trigger, or I can pull the trigger, but I can't actually get anything to happen. It's also impossible to install a cable lock on a loaded weapon. Or even if the weapon was loaded, when you go to install it, you will automatically unload it. Let's say I pull the slide back. Let's try that again. Let's say I were to make a mistake, like pulling the slide back, verifying I've got nothing in the chamber, but I've still got a round in the magazine. Well, if I was doing a trigger lock, I could close the slide and put it on there and forget. Now, that does happen. I'm sure you've all seen the DEA agent that was in a school and tried to demonstrate safe gun handling. He mistakenly left a loaded magazine in the weapon, verified the chamber was empty, dropped the slide, and then he shot himself in the foot. That's not a smart thing to do. But it is something that could be done. So if I was that guy, I might be trying to put a trigger lock on a now loaded weapon, thinking it was unloaded, and well, if I just do it slightly wrong here, let's pull it this way, and then now I've got it. Oop, there we go. Striker fired. I would have put a hole in my basement wall here. When you're doing an actual cable lock, we've got a loaded gun here. We'll load the magazine, reinsert it. Well, I can't feed the cable lock through the magazine, so I've got to drop that out. And now I've got a perfectly safe weapon to feed the cable through. They're no more complicated than doing it with a trigger lock. You'd never have to violate safety rules. Anybody walking up to the weapon, there's no state I can put it in that would make them think it's loaded. With a trigger lock, you're always walking up to an unknown. You've got an obvious object in front of the trigger, and that's kind of a scary situation. You would not want to just walk up and start fiddling with that for fear that if the lock was not installed tight enough, you might actually pull the trigger. Just by picking it up, perhaps the weight would be enough to drop it onto the actual trigger itself. Who knows? But price difference between a $12 good lock and just a simple cable and a padlock are negligible. The cable lock also works with revolvers. Slightly different. You would just simply drop the crane out and feed this through, and now there's no way I can get this to lock back up. You could even use this. You could reuse the same lock if you wanted to. If you were really trying to cut corners here, you would just feed it through this one and then up into the action of the next one. There we go, and back around. And now we've secured two guns well enough that no child will be able to load them or to fire them. They pose no danger to anybody. Anybody walking up to it can see that just at a moment's glance that they're safe. So that's my basic lesson there on trigger locks versus cable locks and why I do not really care for a trigger lock. Obviously I don't, as I don't have keys for this one anymore even. Now granted, I don't use either for storage of my weapons. I have actual locking cabinets for them. I keep them in a room that's locked away from the rest of the house. Keeps children. There's two layers of security here, and I much prefer that over these simple devices. But if you had to go with one or the other, a simple cable through the action is going to do things a lot better than a trigger lock would. And application of a cable lock should never result in a negligent discharge. Whereas a trigger lock, yeah, it's not very likely, but it could happen, and I'd rather not see that happen anyway.